So really excellent response, John. I thought you were just pretty insightful on the topic all around and um, offered a pretty broad understanding of it all. In what you were talking about, one thing that stuck out in my mind was the broad perspective that results whenever these two types, whenever these two, whenever this pairing happens. So, for instance, if you have an INFP and an ENFJ, they both have a very broad perspective in the feeling domain and also to an extent in the intuition domain. Let's take an INTP and an ENTJ. They're one's using introverted thinking as their dominant function, whereas the other is using extroverted thinking as their dominant function. In this case, they're both looking at domain areas where the thinking function is involved. So, like intellectually identifying whether something is valid or not, trying to determine whether something's true or false. So the introverted thinking offers the subjective side of things, the internal process, whereas the extroverted thinking offers a more objective, more external world view of this domain. So together, they both offer a 360-degree view of the thinking domain that other type pairings couldn't offer. However, whenever these types are operating at the worser of their capabilities, whenever they, for instance, an INTP is so focused on their dominant function that they're kind of the other functions, their auxiliary, inferior, and tertiary functions, are sort of slaves to this dominant function, and you get a very one-sided personality. They really overvalue the subjective thinking side of things, and they kind of reject any objective thinking. In this case, any lines of thought that extroverted thinking runs along, introverted thinking will kind of reject this if the personality is that focused on their dominant in that way to an unhealthy extent. I feel like whenever an INTP is in a bad place, they aren't going to be able to consider the viewpoint of the ENTJ, yeah, they're not going to incorporate that viewpoint at all. They're just going to be pushing forward their viewpoint. And the same applies in the other direction. So if the extroverted thinker, the ENTJ, let's say, for example, is very focused on their dominant function to the exclusion of most other functions, then they're going to kind of reject that subjective standpoint, the internal standpoint, the introverted thinking standpoint. You have the introverted thinker on one side, the extroverted thinker on the other side, and they just kind of reach a stalemate. They can't really move forward. They can't. They kind of just reach a standstill where they, I guess you can just say, they don't move at all. They don't move forward in the slightest. Now, this is unique to this type of pairing, I think. Take, for instance, INTP and ENTP. If the INTP is operating at the worser of their thinking capabilities and perhaps cutting out other functions, other viewpoints that differ from theirs to a large extent, then they might still be able to make some progress with the ENTP because the ENTP thinks along almost the same lines of thoughts as the INTP. So I do believe that the weaknesses that I describe here when both types or one type is operating at the worser of their thinking capabilities is unique to the complementary type pairing. So yeah, I guess one of the major strengths of this type pairing is that they can offer a very broadened perspective on things. On the flip side, they can also reach a standstill because their viewpoints are so differing. Maybe one other weak point that I might see from this type pairing is the fact that communication might not come as easily between these two types as other types. So for instance, certain other type pairings. So for instance, the INTP might be able to communicate very well with, once again, an ENTP or an INTP or an ENFP. because they share some of the same functions. I feel like the communication is more one-to-one with certain other types, not the ENTJ or ESTJ. This isn't to say that communication cannot be very good with the ENTJ or ESTJ. I feel like communication can really be pretty awesome and pretty great. However, in some cases, I just feel like it's easier to converse, to really get my viewpoint across or get across what I'm communicating to certain other types more. I'd be interested to hear about what your experiences are with this and whether they ring true with what I'm saying here. Theoretically, I think the fact that the ENTJ and the INTP have completely differing functions, that would theoretically be the basis for why the communication isn't as great as with other types that might share the same cognitive functions. Yeah, I'd be interested to hear how sound you think that hypothesis is. So I mentioned INTP and ENTJ a lot here, but in all the things that I describe, I feel that this applies just as well to complementary type pairings in general.